Four Morethi landing craft came down through the roof of a stadium in North Texas at 3:41 on a Sunday afternoon in September. Their sensors reported a hard surface, a controlled perimeter, and 22 armored combatants in structured engagement below them. Their command link, the same link that had coordinated 31 invasions without a single dropped order, was rated for 115 decibels, with margin. The stadium was at 112. The ball had not been snapped yet. If you enjoy stories where humanity wins in the dumbest possible way, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with somebody who has screamed themselves hoarse over a game that did not need their help. And drop a comment telling me the loudest place you have ever stood in your life, because I promise the answers are better than the video. Now let's go down into the bowl on 3rd and long, and find out what happens when a species that has never needed to shout lands on 80,000 people who paid money to do it. The bowl. The stadium sat on the flat prairie north of the city like something that had been set down rather than built, which is roughly what had happened. 82,000 seats stacked in 3 tiers around a bowl, a retractable roof that took 11 minutes to close, and a concrete ring at the top that did to sound what a satellite dish does to signal. Marcus Ojda had worked in that building for 19 years, which was every year the building had existed, and before that he had worked the old one downtown. He was 58, gray through the beard, and he ran game day operations from a booth on the west side with a view of everything and a clipboard that had outlasted 3 marriages in the department. The clipboard was aluminum, dented on one corner, and had a stopwatch clipped to the ring at the top. Marcus had coached high school ball for 6 years before he got into operations, and he had never once in his life been able to make himself put that stopwatch in a drawer. His run sheet had 41 line items on it: gates at 11:40, band on the field at 2:15, roof decision at 1:00, anthem at 3:07, kickoff at 3:25. He was on item 29 when Dr. Priya Raghunathan came into the booth holding something that looked like a very expensive television remote. "You are at 104, she said. "That's warm-up." "I know what it is. I am telling you what it is." She turned the meter so he could see the display. 104 decibels, sustained in a mostly empty bowl, and the band has not started. Priya was an acoustics engineer, 34, and she was not there because anybody wanted her there. She was there because the building's own staff had started failing hearing screenings. The gate crew, the field-level ushers, the camera operators, and somebody in legal had decided that a study was cheaper than a lawsuit. She had spent 3 weekends in that bowl with a Type 1 sound level meter and a clipboard of her own, and she had reached the conclusion that the stadium was not a venue. It was a machine for concentrating human noise onto 100 yards of grass. "Explain it to me again," Marcus said. "The number thing." "The number thing." Priya sat down on the edge of the console. "Decibels are not a ruler. They are a ratio, and they are logarithmic. Every 10 you add is 10 times the sound power. So 120 is not a little worse than 110. 120 is 10 times the power of 110, and 130 is 100 times. She tapped the meter. When this room gets to 130 on a fourth-quarter goal line stand, and it does, I have the data, it is not slightly louder than a chainsaw. It is a jet engine at 40 feet, held for 11 seconds on purpose by 80,000 people who could stop at any time and do not want to. Marcus wrote a number on his clipboard because that was what he did with information. "Why does this building do it worse than others?" "Because nothing in here is soft," Priya pointed up. "Concrete bowl, steel roof, glass on the end zones. Every hard surface you own throws the sound back at the field instead of letting it out. Open-air stadiums leak. You do not leak, you focus." 12 feet away, Marisol Reyes was doing a level check on the house system and pretending not to listen. Marisol ran audio. She had 11,000 watts of amplification, 4 delay rings, a sub-array under the upper deck, and a rule she had written herself and taped to the board in front of her. "We support the crowd, we do not replace it." Her whole job, as she understood it, was knowing when to get out of the way. Down at field level, Delia Fontaine was walking her drumline into position. Delia was 46, band director, and she carried a pair of bass mallets in her back pocket the way other people carry a phone. She had 9 bass drums, and she had them tuned deliberately low, and if you asked her why, she would tell you that the high stuff is what people hear and the low stuff is what people feel, and that only one of those two things gets a stadium out of its seats. "Ma'am," said one of her sophomores, "the roof's closed. Is it gonna be loud?" "Son," Delia said, "that's the entire idea." Out in Lot C, 300 yards from the west gate, Boone Tackett was at hour 9 of a cook he had started at 6 in the morning. Boone was 62, drove a pickup that had been repainted twice and repaired continuously, and he ran the same 12 feet of asphalt every home game for 14 years. He had 2 propane burners, a offset smoker welded out of a water heater tank, a 4,000-watt generator, 2 coolers of ice, and a folding canopy with a bent leg that he had never once considered replacing. Around him, 20,000 people were doing approximately the same thing. That was the part that outsiders never understood about a parking lot in Texas on a Sunday in September. It was not a crowd waiting to go inside. It was a temporary town of 20,000 with its own food, its own water, its own power, and its own transportation, and it had assembled itself in 4 hours without anyone giving a single order. Hank Whitmore walked past Boone's canopy at 2:20 on his way to the gate. Hank was 79 and had held the same 2 seats since 1974, Section 118, Row 9, and he had buried a wife and a brother and had never missed a home opener. In the bottom of his cooler under the ice, wrapped in a grocery bag, was a compressed air horn that had been banned from the stadium in 2011 and had entered the building on 11 separate occasions since. "Not today, Hank," Boone said without looking up. "Didn't say a word," said Hank. Junior Escamilla, 19, was working the merch cart at the top of the Section 118 tunnel and losing an argument with a card reader that had lost the network. He had figured out that if you held the unit above your head and turned slowly to the left, it sometimes found the signal. He looked, from any distance at all, like a man performing a religious rite. The roof closed at 1:00 because there was a 30% chance of storms off the escarpment to the west, and because the field temperature at noon had read 141 degrees on the artificial turf, which is not an exaggeration, and is the reason nobody in that state schedules an early kickoff if they can help it. Coach Lyle Braddock did not care about any of this except one part of it. "Silent count," he told his offensive line at 2:50, the way he had told them every home game for 6 seasons. "All day, even on defense's possessions, I want you looking at the guard. If you are listening for my quarterback this afternoon, you are already offside." That was not motivational. That was arithmetic. A quarterback's voice at the line of scrimmage arrives at roughly 85 decibels to the man next to him. In a closed bowl at 120, that voice does not exist. It is not quiet. It is gone, buried under something 100 times more powerful. And every offensive line in the league has spent decades learning to run a violent, precisely timed operation with no verbal communication whatsoever, using nothing but a foot lifting off the ground and a hand coming off a knee. They had trained for a loud room until a loud room could not touch them. Nobody in that building thought of it as a defense. It was just Sunday. The anthem finished at 3:09. The kickoff was at 3:25. And at 3:38 on the visitors' second possession, 3rd and 7, the stadium did the thing it was built to do. Priya's meter, held up in the booth, read 112 and climbing. And Marcus Ojda, looking out through the glass at 82,000 people standing up all at once, noticed that the roof had started to dim. Not flicker. Dim evenly the way it does when a cloud crosses over, except the roof was closed and there was no sky up there to cross. The Ascendancy. Prefect Asan Tal of the Merethi Ascendancy had selected the site personally, and he had selected it because it was the only structure on the target world that made immediate strategic sense. The Ascendancy did not conquer populations. That was crude, and it was expensive. The Ascendancy located the institution where a species manufactured its warriors, took it intact, and let the surrender come up from below. Every species keeps its warrior caste somewhere, and every warrior caste has a ground it trains on, and no population in recorded history had continued a war after its own military academy was flying somebody else's flag. It had worked on 31 worlds. It had a success rate that made a career. "Read it to me again," Tal said. Cadre analyst reread it again. "Enclosed structure, sealed roof, retractable, currently sealed, controlled perimeter with restricted entry. Interior floor of engineered surface marked at regular intervals in a graduated measurement grid." A measurement grid. 100 mark. D Division's prefect, numbered, symmetrical about the center. Tal permitted himself the closest thing he had to satisfaction. A graduated field. You do not paint 100 numbered divisions on the ground unless you intend to score performance against them. Combatants. 22 active on the surface, prefect. Armored, helmeted, with reinforced shoulder and thoracic plating. They engage in repeated structured collisions at a fixed interval of approximately 40 seconds, break, reset to a start line, and engage again. Casualties. None observed, they stand back up. Officiating presence. 7 unarmored individuals in high-contrast markings move freely between the combatants and are not attacked. They carry signaling devices and appear to hold absolute authority over the engagement. It halts when they signal. It resumes when they signal. Tal looked at the imaging for a long moment. 22 armored combatants in graduated live contact drill. 7 instructors with unquestioned authority to stop live combat with a single signal. A command box elevated on the western wall with clear sightlines to the entire floor. And ranked around the whole of it, in tiered seating, 82,000 observers. 82,000, he said. Confirmed. What is the observed strength of the largest single military formation on this world? Had been dreading the question because he had already run it. Prefect, the largest single formation we have imaged in one location is roughly 40,000. So there are twice as many of them sitting in that building watching 22 of their own train. That is what the imaging shows. Tal turned away from the display. It is a war college, and they have filled the galleries. Something is being decided down there today. He clasped his hands behind his back. We will take the floor and the command box during the drill while the instructors are unarmed and the galleries are seated. Doctrine speed and standing. That sentence would eventually be reproduced in full, without commentary, on the first page of an amended Morethi Field Manual. The Ascendancy has always understood that the most damaging thing you can do to a bad decision is quote it exactly. Ran the environmental clearance because he was thorough, and because he was thorough, he found the number. Morethi Command did not use radio. It never had. The Ascendancy coordinated through a resonance link, a continuous low-band acoustic carrier that passed orders as pressure modulation through the atmosphere itself. It was elegant. It could not be jammed by anything electromagnetic. It required no orbital relay, and it degraded so gracefully that in 31 campaigns the Ascendancy had never once lost unit-to-unit coordination. It had one specification, and the specification had never mattered. The carrier tolerated ambient acoustic pressure up to 115 decibels. Above that, the modulation floor drowned and the link went to noise. That threshold had been set 4 centuries earlier, and it had been set generously because the Ascendancy had established as a matter of settled survey doctrine that advanced species get quieter. It was one of the most reliable correlations in the archive. Sound is waste. Sound is inefficiency, friction, combustion, unshielded machinery, populations that have not yet learned to move without announcing themselves. A world at first industrialization roars. A world at maturity hums. In 31 campaigns, the highest sustained ambient reading the Ascendancy had ever logged on an inhabited world was 96 decibels, and that had been at a smelting complex, and it had lasted 40 minutes. Rhee's 11-year survey of Earth agreed. Traffic corridors 70 to 80, industrial districts high 80s, transit hubs 91, population centers at their most congested 94. Nothing on the planet held above 100, not anywhere, not for long. Ambient projection for the interior, Tal asked. 96 to 102, Prefect. Enclosed volume, hard surfaces, well inside tolerance. There is one thing that must be said in Cadreanalyst Rhee's defense, and the Ascendancy's own review board eventually said it for him. His survey was not wrong. Every reading he took was accurate. He had measured a species going about its business for 11 years, and he had correctly established that human beings at work in traffic, in factories, in crowds, do not exceed 100 decibels. What he had never once measured was a human being at leisure. The 4 landing craft came down through the roof at 3:41. The roof was closed. This was not, in the Ascendancy's view, a problem. The craft were designed to breach a hardened perimeter, and they breached it, cleanly, cutting an 11-meter aperture through steel and glazed panel with almost no debris. and the 4 craft descended into the bowl in the slow ceremonial drop the ascendancy used for the seizure of a martial institution. The ceremonial drop takes 40 seconds. That gave 82,000 people 40 full seconds to get their phones out. Sub-Leader Cavest led the floor detail. 60 troopers, 4 craft, weapons at rest per doctrine, because the entire point of the ceremonial drop is that a warrior caste which sees you arrive without weapons drawn is a warrior caste that reports it accurately to its government. At the moment the aperture opened, the stadium was at 112 decibels, and it was at 112 because the visiting offense was in a third down set, and the crowd had stood up to do what it had come there to do. Then something cut a hole in the roof. Marcus Ojda would spend the rest of his professional life trying to explain the next 4 seconds to people who had not been in the building, and he never got it right, and he stopped apologizing for that around year 3. 82,000 people did not scream. That was the part that mattered. There was no shriek, no panic surge, none of the sounds a crowd makes when a crowd is afraid. What 82,000 people did in a closed concrete bowl with the third down noise already loaded in their chests, and 4 unidentified craft descending into their stadium at the speed of a freight elevator, was lean in and get louder. Priya Raghunathan's meter went to 126. Marcus, she said, and she was not frightened, which she would feel strange about for years. Marcus, look at the number. Down on the floor, at 30 feet from touchdown, Sub-Leader Cavest's resonance link filled with a flat wall of nothing. Prefect, he said, into a channel that no longer existed. Prefect. He tried the unit band. Noise. He tried the cadre band. Noise. He tried the emergency low band, which had never been used operationally in the history of the Ascendancy, and got noise so total that his own transmission came back at him as pressure against the inside of his helmet. 60 troopers touched down on 100 yards of engineered turf at 141 degrees surface temperature, in the middle of a graduated measurement grid, in front of 82,000 observers, with no command link, no unit coordination, and no way to tell each other anything at all. And 31 worlds of doctrine had never prepared a single one of them for what happens next in a building like that, which is that the officials blow their whistles and stop play. The whistle. 7 officials stopped a football game with 7 whistles, and that ended the invasion of North America 9 minutes before anybody in the building understood it. Referee Curtis Amya had been officiating for 22 years, and he had a card in his left sleeve pocket with the stoppage protocol printed on it, and he had never in his life had cause to use Line 9. Line 9 read, unauthorized entry onto the field of play, officials suspend, players to sideline, crew to center. It had been written for streakers. Curtis blew his whistle, held it, put both arms straight up over his head, and walked toward the 50. Not away, toward. That is the entire job. A referee's authority in that building is not physical, and it is not armed, and it comes from exactly one thing, which is that he walks toward the problem while everyone else is deciding. Curtis got to the 50-yard line with 60 armored beings from another star standing on it, and he stopped 6 feet from the nearest one, and he blew the whistle one more time, and he pointed at the sideline. Sub-Leader Cavest, with no command link, no orders, and no way to ask anyone for any, watched an unarmored biped in high-contrast striping walk into the middle of his formation and gesture at the boundary of the field. Then he watched 22 armored combatants, the warrior caste, the entire reason the Ascendancy had come to this building, turn away from him and jog to the edges of the floor and stand there. No engagement, no challenge. They had simply gone where the striped one pointed. Cavest reached the only conclusion available to a well-trained officer with no communications. The instructors have suspended the drill, which meant the 7 striped individuals were the ranking authority in the facility, which meant the correct doctrinal action was contact, not force, because the Ascendancy's entire method depended on taking a martial institution with its command structure intact and functioning. Cavest opened his external speaker, which worked fine. The speaker was a speaker. It did not care about ambient noise. It just could not be heard. And he addressed Curtis Amya in the formal cadence of the Merethi Ascendancy. And what came out of it into a bowl at 119 decibels was inaudible even to Cavest. Curtis saw a large armored being move its head slightly. He pointed at the sideline again. "Sir," said the back judge over Curtis's shoulder, "I don't think it speak." Whistle. Everybody speaks whistle, said Curtis and pointed a third time. Up in the operations booth, Marcus Ojda was doing the least glamorous work in the history of First Contact. He was running his evacuation sheet. Gates, he said. All of them, open. Every gate, every level, tunnel doors too, and I want nobody standing in a doorway trying to check tickets on the way out. Do you hear me? Nobody funnels. Marcus. Nobody funnels. He had 4 numbers written on his clipboard from 19 years of drills, and the numbers said that 82,000 people can clear that bowl in 11 minutes through every aperture at once, and cannot clear it at all through half of them. Crowd deaths in a building like that have almost never been caused by whatever people were running from. Marisol Reyes had her hand on the house microphone. Do I make the announcement? Marcus looked at the meter in Priya's hand. 119. Marisol, can they hear you at 119? Marisol looked at her own board at 11,000 watts of amplification, and she gave the honest answer, which is the reason she was good at her job. No, I'm 40,000 people short. Then don't waste it. Put the exits on the boards and the ribbon, all 4 sides, green arrows, nothing else, no words longer than 4 letters. She was already doing it. Priya, talk to me. Priya Raghunathan had spent 3 weekends measuring that building and 11 years measuring rooms before it, and she was standing in the exact center of the only professional question she had ever cared about. They came in at 112, she said, and they landed at 119, and they have not moved from the 50 in 90 seconds. Marcus, that formation stopped moving the instant the noise came up. Coincidence? Maybe watch their heads, she pointed. Down on the floor, 60 troopers in a loose ring were doing something that read, to anyone who has ever been in a room with bad audio, as unmistakable. They were turning their heads slowly, all of them, in the way a person turns their head when they are trying to find where a sound is coming from, and there is nowhere left. They're not scanning for threats, Priya said. That's not a search pattern. They're triangulating. Every one of them is trying to locate a signal, and every one of them is failing, and they have been failing since the exact second we crossed 115. Marcus wrote 115 on the aluminum clipboard. You're telling me their radios don't work in here. I'm telling you that whatever they use, it lives in air. Look at them. She lowered the meter. Marcus, if they were on radio, our own network would be down and my phone would be dead, and it isn't. Whatever they're running is acoustic. It's pressure. And this building is the single worst room on the surface of this planet for anything that lives in pressure, and it is not even close. Hank Whitmore, section 118, row 9, was not evacuating. He had lived 79 years. He had been coming into that building since it opened, and into the old one since 1974. And he had made an assessment which was, in fairness, entirely correct. The things on the field had not fired at anybody, and an old man moving down a concrete ramp in a hurry was in considerably more danger than an old man staying put. He reached into his cooler under the ice and took out a grocery bag. Section 118 watched him do it. Hank, said the woman in row 9, seat 4, who had been sitting next to him for 11 seasons, you are not. They came in through the roof, Hank said. They didn't pay. The arithmetic. At 3:52, Prefect Asantal was 11 minutes into an operation he could no longer see. Restore the link. The link is not down, Prefect. Cadre Analyst Re had gone the peculiar shade that analysts go when the data is intact and the interpretation has collapsed. That is what I am trying to say. The carrier is transmitting at full power. Every emitter is functioning. The ground detail is transmitting. We are receiving. Then read me the traffic. There is no traffic. There is a floor. Re put it on the display because a number is easier to survive than a sentence. Ambient acoustic pressure inside that structure. Current sustained reading 121 decibels. Tal did not understand it immediately, and it is worth being precise about why, because the review board eventually spent a great deal of time on it. He heard the number. The number was correct. His mind refused the shape of it, in the way that a mind refuses a shape it has no shelf for. That is above the smelting complex. It is 25 decibels above the smelting complex, Prefect. It is more than 300 times the acoustic power of the loudest industrial site we have ever logged on an inhabited world. Then the structure is generating it. It is a countermeasure they knew we were. Prefect, Ree had never interrupted a superior in his life, and he did it. And he was promoted for it 14 months later, which is what the ascendancy does when an analyst is proven right in a way that costs the fleet something. The structure is not generating it. I have the spectral breakdown. It is not machinery. There is no fundamental, no harmonic series, no periodicity of any kind. Then what is it? It is 82,000 voices. There was a silence on the command deck of a warship, which is a very quiet room, and which was at that moment approximately 119 decibels quieter than Section 118. They are shouting, Tal said. Continuously, for 11 minutes. Prefect, they were shouting before we breached. The reading was 112 when the aperture opened. Our arrival raised it 7 decibels, and they have not stopped since. At what at us? And here Ree gave the report that ended 31 campaigns worth of doctrine, and he gave it flatly, because there was no way to dress it. Not primarily, Prefect. Approximately 40 seconds before the breach, the 22 combatants on the floor entered a start position, and the galleries rose and produced 112 decibels. They did that 4 times in the 18 minutes preceding our arrival. Each occurrence corresponded to a reset of the drill. He turned the display. It is not a response to threat. It is scheduled. The galleries are not observers. They are participants, and their contribution is volume, and they deliver it on cue. Why? To degrade the coordination of the 22. Tal turned very slowly. Say that again. The armored combatants operate in 2 formations of 11. Analysis of the pre-breach footage shows one formation issuing verbal instruction at the start line and the other formation attempting to disrupt it. The galleries produce maximum output only when the formation nearest to them is the one attempting to communicate. Ree's voice had gone strange. Prefect, 82,000 individuals have assembled in an enclosed, hard-surfaced volume for the express purpose of denying acoustic communication to 11 of their own soldiers as a training stress. That is not a war college, Tal said. No, Prefect, it is worse. It is a war college for this. They have selected for it. Whatever formation is down there has spent its entire career learning to operate a violent, time-critical engagement with its verbal channel completely destroyed, in a room built specifically to destroy it, in front of 82,000 people whose job is to destroy it harder. Ree looked up, and we landed our command doctrine in the middle of it. Tal stood at the display for a long moment. How does the ground detail coordinate without the link? It doesn't. Then how do they? Prefect Ree said, they lift a foot. The elegant, unjammable, 400-year-old Morethi resonance link had exactly one design assumption underneath it, and the assumption was not technical. It was philosophical. It was the settled observation that advanced species get quieter, that noise is waste, and a mature civilization sheds it. The observation is correct. Human industry is quieter than it was a century ago. Human engines, human factories, human transit, all of it trending down, all of it exactly as the archive predicted. The ascendancy had simply never encountered a species that got quieter at work, and then, on its own time, for no productive reason at all, built the loudest rooms on its planet and filled them on purpose. There was no shelf in the archive for recreational sound. There was no category for a population that spends money to stand in a jet engine. Down on the floor, Subleader Kavast made a decision that would be taught at the Morethi Survey Academy for a generation, and he made it well, and it was the last good decision available to him. He could not communicate with orbit. He could not communicate with his own troopers beyond arm's length. He had 60 personnel standing on a surface reading 60 degrees above their suits design ambient, in a bowl whose pressure environment was actively disassembling the only command architecture his species had ever used. So he stopped trying to invade and started trying to leave, in good order with everyone. He formed his troopers into a physical chain, hand to shoulder, shoulder to hand, the oldest signal architecture in the galaxy. And he turned to find the ranking local authority, which he had already correctly identified as the unarmored individual in the striped covering who had walked into the middle of 60 armored soldiers and pointed. Kavast approached Curtis Amya, and he did the one thing available to him. He knelt on one knee, put his palm flat on the turf, and then raised the same hand and pointed at the aperture in the roof. Curtis Amya, 22 years an official, looked at that for about a second and a half. Then he pointed at the roof too, and then at the tunnel, and then he tapped his own CH. Eston made a rolling go-ahead gesture with both hands that every human being on Earth understands, and that had, at that moment, no business working across 900 light years. "He's asking to leave," Curtis said to the back judge. "How do you figure?" "Because that's how you ask to leave," said Curtis. The fourth quarter. What happened next was not a battle, and the Morethi ascendancy would spend 4 years insisting that it was. It was a stadium doing the only thing it had ever been asked to do, on schedule, while 60 invaders tried to walk out through it. The problem was the West Tunnel. The aperture in the roof was directly above the 50, and the 4 landing craft were sitting on the floor, and the craft could not lift while the bowl was still full because Cavest, to his lasting credit, and the review board said so, refused to run engines over an occupied gallery. He had 60 troopers to move to the West Tunnel on foot, and the West Tunnel let out under Section 118. Marcus Ojda saw it before anyone else, because he had run that building for 19 years, and he knew what was in every corridor at every minute of a game day. "They're walking into the concourse," he said. "Marisol, the West Concourse is full. That's 12,000 people trying to get out and 60 of those things trying to get in, and if they meet in that tunnel somebody dies and it will not be one of the aliens." "Then hold the tunnel." "With what?" Priya Raghunathan lowered her sound meter. "Marcus," she said, "don't hold the tunnel, move the crowd off it." She was already turning toward Marisol. "You said you were 40,000 people short. You are, but you are not trying to talk to 40,000 people. You are trying to move one section." "One section," Marisol said. 118 and 119. That's it. That's 4,000. And they are already standing, and they are already looking at the field, and they will move as a block if something gives them a reason to look somewhere else. "I've got 11,000 watts, and I can't beat 121. "You don't have to beat it," Priya said. "You have to go under it." And Marisol Reyes, who had a piece of tape on her board that said, "We support the crowd. We do not replace it," understood immediately because it was her entire professional life in one sentence. 82,000 human voices occupy a specific band. It is roughly 200 hertz to 4,000 hertz, and it is enormously powerful, and it is completely useless below about 80 hertz because a human throat cannot make that. The sub-array under the upper deck could. It had been installed for exactly one purpose, which was to make people's chests move during introductions. "Delia," Marcus said into the radio, "Delia, are you still on the floor?" Delia Fontaine was still on the floor, because she had 9 bass drums and 41 teenagers, and she had decided within about 4 seconds of the roof opening that the safest place for 41 teenagers was standing in formation looking at her, which is a judgment that a great many people have since described as heroic, and which Delia has always described as the only thing I know how to do. "West End Zone," she said, "all 9. Can your drumline follow the house sub?" "Son," said Delia Fontaine, "my drumline can follow a heartbeat." What they built took 90 seconds, and every part of it was people doing their normal jobs slightly wrong on purpose. Marisol dropped everything above 80 hertz out of the West delay ring and put a slow rising subtone into the seating bowl at section 118. No words, no music, nothing anybody could name. Delia put 9 low-tuned bass drums onto it in unison at the same interval, from field level aimed up. And the ribbon boards on the west face went green and put an arrow 4 feet tall, pointing north. 4,000 people in sections 118 and 119 stopped looking at the field. They did not stop because they were told. They stopped because something below the range of anything they had ever heard in that building came up through the concrete under their feet in time, and every human nervous system on the planet interprets low-frequency pressure the same way, which is pay attention. They looked at the arrow, and 4,000 people moved north. The West Tunnel cleared in 110 seconds. Marcus Ojda would say, later and repeatedly, and to anyone who tried to make it more than it was, that he had not defeated anything. "We ran an evacuation," he said. "We ran it well. That's the whole story. Nobody in that booth did one thing that wasn't already on the sheet." 60 Morethi troopers came up the West Tunnel in a hand-to-shoulder chain through a corridor that had been full 90 seconds earlier and was now lined on both sides. Behind the rails, back 20 feet, held there by 4 stadium ushers and a 19-year-old with a broken card reader who had put his arms out and said, "Back up. yawl back. Up about 200 times. Nobody threw anything. Nobody swung at anybody. That is not what happened, and it matters, because the Ascendancy's own record is unambiguous on the point. What happened in the West Concourse of that stadium is that a man named Boone Tackett, who had come in from Lot C at a dead run when the roof opened, and who had been standing at the top of the tunnel for 11 minutes with no idea what to do about any of it, watched a trooper at the back of the chain go down onto one knee on the concrete with its suit alarming. The turf had read 141 degrees. The suits had been standing on it for 19 minutes. Boone had a cooler. He had dragged it up from Lot C without thinking about why, in the way that a certain kind of person cannot leave a cooler behind, and it had 40 pounds of ice in it, and 11 bottles of water, and a bag of frozen sausage he had never gotten around to cooking. He put the ice on the concrete next to a soldier from another star and stepped back and said, "It's cold. It's just cold." The trooper looked at the ice for a long moment. Then it put both gauntlets down into it. The suit alarm stopped. Boone Tackett has been asked about this several thousand times, and his answer has never varied. It was hot and he was down. I don't know what else you want me to say about it. At 4:14, the last of the chain reached the tunnel mouth. At 4:19, the bowl was clear enough for engines. And at 4:26, 3 of the 4 landing craft lifted through the aperture in the roof. The 4th did not, because its port intake had drawn debris during the breach, and it sat on the 50-yard line for 2 days while the Morethi Ascendancy negotiated its recovery with a stadium operations manager who had been given the file because nobody else in the building knew where anything was. And at 4:31, with the bowl 3/4 empty and the field full of nothing but a broken alien warship and 11 officials standing around it, Hank Whitmore, Section 118, Row 9, still in his seat, still not evacuating, took a band compressed air horn out of a grocery bag and let it go for 4 full seconds. It read 129 decibels at his own ear. There was nobody left in the building for it to affect. The Morethi were gone. It served no purpose whatsoever. That is the part the Ascendancy has never been able to file. The amendment. The Morethi Review Board sat for 4 years, which is a long time for a species that had settled its war doctrine 4 centuries earlier and had not reopened it once. Prefect Asantal gave the most honest report of his career, and it was short. He had identified a martial institution by every metric in the survey manual. His imaging had been accurate. His analysts' 11-year acoustic survey had been accurate. His troopers had followed doctrine exactly. He had lost an operation, 1 landing craft, and the entire coordination architecture of the Ascendancy, and he had never once been fired upon. Then identify the opposing force, the board said. Cadre Analyst submitted the finding, and the finding is the reason the document is still the most requested file in the Morethi archive. The opposing force had not been the 22 armored combatants. Those individuals had left the floor within 9 seconds of the breach, at the instruction of an unarmed official, and had not returned. The opposing force had not been the 7 officials, who had suspended the engagement, escorted the landing party to the exit, and gestured a foreign military off their premises with their hands. The opposing force had not been any weapon, or any countermeasure, or any technology at all. The opposing force had been 82,000 civilians making noise at a scheduled interval for their own enjoyment, in a building they had constructed specifically to make that noise louder, on an afternoon that had been printed on a calendar 11 months in advance. The board took a long time with that. The acoustic hazard index was rebuilt from the ground up, and it required 4 new levels above the old maximum, 3 of which describe structures that exist only on Earth. The resonance link was not redesigned. It could not be 4 centuries of hardware do not move, so the Ascendancy did the only other thing available and issued the link a written entry in the survey manual, which is a thing the Morethi Ascendancy had done 6 times in its recorded history. It reads in full, "This species is quiet when it works. Every reading you take of its industry, its transit, and its labor will be accurate, and every one of them will be irrelevant. It reserves its maximum acoustic output for activity that produces nothing, decides nothing, and is undertaken voluntarily at personal expense. There is no productive correlate. Do not survey a world during its working hours. Survey it on its days of rest, and if you find an enclosed structure with a hard interior and a graduated F. Lord, do not enter it while it is occupied. The occupants have already built the loudest room their engineering permits, and they will fill it, and they are not doing it to you. The doctrine took 3 amendments. The first requires all acoustic tolerances to be surveyed across a full local calendar, rather than a working cycle. The second removes the clause establishing that advanced species trend toward quiet, and replaces it with a clause noting that a species may become efficient in its labor and remain extravagant in its leisure, and that the second tells you far more about it than the first. The third is 1 line long, and it is the one that Morethi officers quote to each other. If a species built the room on purpose, assume it can survive the room. Subleader Cavast was neither promoted nor disciplined. He was reassigned to survey, where he now teaches a mandatory module, and every class begins the same way. He plays a recording of 121 decibels of human voices in a closed bowl, and he asks the trainees what military system produced it, and every class guesses, and he lets them guess. Then he tells them, down in North Texas, the game was replayed 11 days later in front of an announced crowd of 82,000, and an actual crowd of 82,300, which the stadium has never explained. Marcus Ojda filed his incident report and made it as boring as he possibly could. He wrote that unauthorized aircraft had entered the seating bowl through the roof aperture, that the facility had executed a full evacuation in 9 minutes and 40 seconds against a drill standard of 11, that no patron injuries had been reported beyond 2 sprained ankles on the north ramp, and that assistance had been rendered to 1 distressed non-terrestrial individual by a patron at the West Tunnel. He did not write the sentence he actually said out loud in the booth at 4:26, when the third craft went up through the hole in his roof, and Priya asked him how he wanted the win recorded. "It isn't a win," Marcus said. "We didn't beat them. They just walked into the room on the 1 afternoon of the week we use it." Priya Raghunathan's acoustic study was finally published, and it runs to 71 pages, and 68 of them are about reverberation and hearing conservation in enclosed sports venues and are extremely boring and are now taught in 4 universities. 3 of them are an appendix, and the appendix has been photocopied more than anything else she will write in her life. Her conclusion is the line people quote: "Noise is not primitive. Noise is surplus. A species that has to shout to be heard is a species at work. A species that shouts when it has nothing to gain has energy left over, and energy left over is the only reliable measure of how well a civilization is actually doing." Delia Fontaine's drumline was invited to 11 things it had never been invited to before, and Delia declined 9 of them because they conflicted with rehearsal. Marisol Reyes still has the tape on her board. Somebody suggested she take it down and frame it. She said it works better where it is. Junior Escamilla owns the merch cart now. He printed shirts. They say West Tunnel, back UP y'all, and he has never once explained them to a customer who did not already know. Boone Tackett was in Lot C at 6 in the morning on the day of the replay, and he had a new cooler in the bed of the truck, and when people asked him about it, he said it was for the ice. Hank Whitmore, 79, Section 118, Row 9, was fined $200 for the air horn under a stadium conduct rule that has existed since 2011. He paid it in cash at the guest services window on the day of the replay before the gates opened. And then he went and sat down in his seat. If you made it this far, do me a favor and drop a comment. Tell me which part got you, the referee walking towards 60 of them, having to say the words they are shouting, Boone and the cooler, or Hank paying the fine in cash. And share this with the one person you know who has lost their voice at a game and gone back the next week anyway. Because here is the last thing, and it is the only part that ever really mattered in that building. 6 years later, a Morethi survey vessel passed over North America on a Sunday afternoon in autumn, mapping ambient acoustic pressure for the avoidance annex. Its instruments logged 119 decibels from an enclosed structure in Ohio, 122 from one in Louisiana, 126 from a bowl in Washington state that the annex had flagged in red. The officer on watch pulled the aggregate and found 411 of them distributed across the continent, all reading above the link threshold, all of them peaking within the same 4-hour window. He leaned over the readout for a long moment. They're all doing it at once, he said.